Hi guys, in this tutorial I'll be showing you how to assemble this tabletop rose flower fairy. This is the second fairy in my Sitting Flower Fairy series. Here is my first fairy, which you may have already seen. This fairy has a peony for her wings, and both fairies have bud vines cascading out of their wings. For this rose fairy, the vines are made up of small rosebuds. And I've also added some decorative leaves that you can place inside her wings. I spent a little more time on these leaves compared to my other fairies, creating this cutout design because I wanted them to be bold and create a nice backdrop for the rose wings. As with my other fairies, this one is pretty easy to put together. And here's a quick look at my other tabletop fairies. If you're looking to fill up a party table, or if you know a fairy lover, these would make a great gift collection. And I'll include a link in the description below for these other fairies. So as usual, I am going to review what you will see in your download. If you're familiar with my other tutorials and you want to skip this next part, where I go over the files, you can skip to around the 5-minute and 45-second mark to get to the assembly part. So in your zip folder, you will see two folders, one called Table Rose Flower Fairy Cutouts and a second called Table Rose Flower Fairy Design. To make your fairy, you'll be using files in the Cutouts folder, which we'll look at in a bit. The fairy you see here is in the Design folder. And in this folder, you'll find this fairy in a variety of file formats like EPS or SVG and PNG. I included this fairy for anyone who might want to print it out or perhaps use it on a poster. The PNG file has the fairy on a transparent background, so if you want to add her to an existing image, use the PNG format. In the Cutouts folder is where you'll find the files you need to actually make this fairy. When you open that folder, you'll see two more folders in there. One called Table Rose Flower Fairy Body and the other called Table Rose Flower Fairy Vines. In the Body folder is where I've placed the fairy's body. Here you'll find one body with the rose wings attached and one body with no wings. The wings for this body can be found in the Vines folder, which I'll show you shortly. For this tutorial, we'll be using this fairy here with the wings attached, but I'll also show you how to attach the rose wings if you use this fairy body. This fairy will allow you to cut her wings out in a different color, like this fairy here where I've cut the rose out in red glitter paper. Before we move on, I want to point out a few things here with the fairy's body. As you can see, I've doubled each body and I've also flipped them so that they're mirror images of each other. To make one fairy, you will need two bodies and they will be attached back to back. So if you're using one-sided paper like glitter paper, make sure you cut them out as they are here in mirror image of each other. This is so that the glitter or decorative side of the paper will face the correct way once your fairy is assembled. The other thing to note is that this body set here is the exact same as this set. However, within each set, the bodies are not exactly the same, even though they may look the same. The difference is the legs are at slightly different angles, so when you assemble your fairy, you'll see that the legs will be staggered like this. Just a small design feature and something to note. And the last thing I want to talk about is the black dotted lines you see here. These are your fold lines, so you want to make sure they cut as dotted lines. When you import SVG files into Design Space, which is the software that Cricut Machine users use, these dotted lines will import as solid lines. So you'll need to ungroup these fold lines from the fairy's body and change them from basic cut to score lines before you cut. Also make sure you group them back with the bodies before you cut. If your software imports them as dotted lines, then you don't need to do anything. And now let's look at the second folder, which is the Vines folder. This is where you'll find the rose wings that were missing from the fairy in the last folder we just looked at, and also the vines and leaves that we'll be using to decorate the wings. So these two pieces are the rose wings, and just like the fairy's body, make sure you change these black fold lines to dotted lines if your software is importing them as solid cut lines. These two pieces are the backing pieces for the wings, which is the dark pink color you see filling in the spaces in the rose here. And these are the rosebud vines that will be hanging out of the wings, and these are the leaves. And just like the fairy's body, I've doubled up and flipped the wing pieces and also flipped the vines so they're ready to be cut on single-sided paper if needed. Except for the leaves, which I haven't laid out in any particular way. If you want to use glitter paper for the leaves, I would just place them so that some are facing one way and the others are facing the other side of the fairy so that you can see the glitter from both sides of your fairy. Also, for the fairy we're making today, I'll be using 3 leaf branches. I've just cut an extra one of this 4-leaf branch, and feel free to use however many leaf branches you want for your fairy. So those are all the parts you will receive in your download. Now let's assemble our fairy. Here are the materials you'll need. The double-sided tape I like to use has a lining on it, and you can find a link for it in the description below. Here are the parts we'll be using to make our fairy. As I mentioned, we'll be making a fairy with the wings attached, but let me first show you how to attach the wings if you're making the fairy with the detached wings. Here are my parts for a fairy with detached wings. Basically, this is how the 2 fairy bodies will be assembled, and you can see here why you need to cut out mirror images of the wings when your paper is one-sided. And of course, this goes for the fairy bodies as well, but as long as you cut your pieces as I've laid them out in your download, you will be fine. And also notice how there is a right and wrong way to attach the wings. If you attach it like this, with that large petal at the top, the rose and the head of the fairy will overlap, and we don't want that to happen. So make sure you have your rose wing attached the correct way with the 2 smaller petals at the top, like this. The other thing I want to point out is to make sure your vines are attached correctly, because one will sit on one side of the fairy and the second vine will sit on the other side of the fairy. So when you attach them, make sure the decorative or glitter side is facing the correct side. So here I have white fairy bodies with the red glitter rose wings. To help with assembling, first lay out your fairy bodies like this. I have the fairies' bodies facing each other and the rose wings with the glitter side facing upwards. The first thing you do is fold up your rose wings at the fold lines. Do this to both wings. Then place some double-sided tape on the band below the fold line. You can also use glue here if you prefer. And you want to stay below that fold line. Repeat with your second wing. And now if you have lining on your tape, remove it and attach the wing band behind the fairy's body. Line up that fold line right up to the fairy's back. You'll see 2 small bumps on her back that will help you with the placement of the wing. The space between those bumps will line up perfectly with the width of the wing fold. And just do a quick check that the wing is not overlapping the fairy's head. Repeat this with your second fairy, but of course creating a mirror image of the first fairy. And now we have a fairy with wings attached. Now I'm going to move to using the fairy cutouts with the attached wings. So here are my cutouts. When you attach your 2 fairy bodies together, if you're using regular cardstock with color on both sides, it won't matter which one goes in front or in back, because the only difference it'll make is in the legs. So to start, take one fairy body and lay it down the way I have here. Now, if you're working with a fairy in which you've attached different colored wings, it will matter which side of the fairy you start with here. You want to start with the side of the fairy body with the wing band exposed, so basically the back of the fairy. It doesn't matter which of the 2 fairy bodies you start with, just make sure you're working with the back of the fairy, which is the side on which you attach the wing. So first fold all the fold lines away from you, just so they become more prominent. We're going to be attaching the wing backing like this. So cut a piece of double-sided tape, just a thin strip, and place it in the space on the rose wing above the wing fold line. Then remove the lining and attach the wing backing. Make sure to align the wing backing with the fairy's wing fold line, and if you do that and center it in that spot, it should cover the rose wing nicely. If you've placed it correctly, you should see a nice even border of the wing behind it on the outer edges, because the backing piece is a little smaller than the wing. And now repeat with the other fairy, making sure it's flipped and facing the opposite side of the first fairy. Remember, I started with my first fairy's head on the left, so now this fairy's head should be on the right. And just repeat the same steps. And now we have our fairy bodies ready. We can move on to attaching the vines and leaves. Take one fairy and flip it over so the back is facing you. Here I'm going to measure the wing fold line just for demonstration's sake. You don't have to be this precise. The fold line is about 1¼ inches long, so cut a piece of double-sided tape about that length. The tape I'm using is 5/8 of an inch wide, which is perfect for this fairy. Don't worry if your tape is a different width. Anywhere between 1/4 inch and 5/8 of an inch is fine. So place your tape along the wing fold line on the fairy's body. Then remove the lining. Now with the adhesive exposed, we are going to attach the vines and leaves. So if we look at a finished fairy, we are going to have one leaf branch and one bud vine opening one way, and 2 leaf branches and one bud vine opening the other way with the second wing. This will determine the order in which we place each item, but of course once they're attached, it's easy to just shimmy them around like this, so don't worry if you don't place them in the right order. So I'm going to first place my short vine first. Place it so the end of the vine is overlapping the adhesive tape by about 1/4 to 1/2 inch. Make sure it's at the bottom end of the tape nearest to the fairy's skirt, and also make sure that no part of it is overlapping the fairy's body. Next, take the leaf branch with 4 leaves and place it near the vine, but leave a little room for our second vine. Also, notice that I have the slight curve of the leaf branch curving downwards with the vine. Then take a leaf branch with 3 leaves and place it near the top of the tape, closest to the fairy's head. Again, make sure that the leaves are not overlapping with her head. And there's one side of leaf branches and vine done. Now let's attach the other side. Take your long bud vine and place it between the first vine and leaf branch. Again, make sure that no part of the vine is overlapping with the fairy's body. And last is our last leaf branch, which I'm going to place in the center of the other 2. Remember, you can place as many leaf branches and vines as you want. If you want a fuller look, go for it. When you're done adding your leaves and vines, cut another piece of tape approximately the same size as the first and place it directly on top of the first tape. Then cover the rest of the fairy's body with more tape. Make sure your tape is not crossing over any of the fold lines for the skirt and the legs. Now take your second fairy body and align it on top. Try to align all the edges as best you can. Once you have it aligned, hold down both fairies, then lift up the top fairy to expose the tape at the wing. And with your X-Acto knife, reach in and remove that lining. Then drop your top fairy down to attach the 2 fairies together. Now gently open up the top fairy to remove the tape lining from the remaining pieces at the skirt and at the head. And that's it for assembling the fairy. Now let me show you how to get her ready for display. First, fold up her skirt folds all the way up to her body. We want these folds to sit at a nice sharp right angle. Then fold open her legs a little bit. And lastly, peel open her wings, leaves, and vines layer by layer. Then I like to give each rosebud on the vines a slight twist, which will give it a little dimension. And do the same with the other vine. Now when you go to sit your fairy down on a flat surface, she probably won't sit up straight right away. First, make sure the vines are sitting on each side of her body. And next, find the spot where the vines curl under her wing and curl that spot so that the vine is not touching the wing, because that will affect how your fairies sit. You can also curl the end of the vine down so that it drapes over the table. And now you see my fairy is leaning one way, and it's because of that second vine. So do the same with the second vine and curl it at that spot where it curls under the wing. We want to move that vine away from the wing. Then, after correcting the vines so that they're not pushing on the wings, if you're finding that your fairy is still not sitting up straight, adjust her body at the skirt folds until she's upright and straight. And you're done. Your fairy is ready for display. I hope you guys enjoyed this rose fairy. If you'd like to see more projects from me, you can subscribe to my YouTube channel here or follow me on Instagram and Pinterest. And thank you again to all of you who have supported me with my designs. I really appreciate it. Bye everyone.